Thank you. Hi, I'm Dave, and I write books. I'm still not used to saying that. I have that sort of delighted child thrill that I'm somehow let in the room. Not this room, although frankly that's also quite surprising, but like the room of being a writer. I used to think you had to be allowed to be a writer, and you don't. There's no passport, there's no council, there's no Grand High Pumbaa. Don't tell John Banville, he'd be really upset. People like to make writing into a mystical process. When I say people, I mean writers, because it's good business sense to make what you can do seem like a thing only you can do. And writers need mysticism because without that, we're just people with bad internet histories who talk to themselves. I'm against mysticism, generally. Teaching and writing for kids kind of knocks that out of you. You can be in the middle of like a huge dramatic talk about creativity and inspiration, and a kid will just put up their hand and go, "What does the word indeed mean?" And you're like, what does it mean? I was doing an event once where all the kids had read the book, and so there was 125 kids. They had loads of really in-depth questions, and I said, look, we're coming to the end. We only have a little bit of time left. I want your best question. This has to be really good. And like a crossbow, this kid was like, I've got a question. And I was like, okay, this has to be really good now. It's like our final question. He's like, oh, I know. And I was like, all right, give it to me. Your best question. What is it? And he was like, what's your favorite number? And I was like, 7. Good night, everybody. So, specifics. I teach a lot of writing classes, and the first question I get asked is, how do you become a writer? No, that's a lie. The first question I get asked is, why is your beard so magnificent? Beard oil and a tiny comb. It's true. But the second question I get asked is, how do you become a writer? And it's quite a tough question to answer because I'm an authority to like the edge of my skin and no further. I know how I ended up being a 29-year-old man who spends most of the day in his pajamas Googling throwing knives, but the problem with writing and with arts jobs in general is that there's no blueprint. Writing courses, daily prompt challenges, retreats, groups, masters, living in a driftwood cave and writing poems on your feet with the tears of fish. There seems to be a lot of different paths to it. And this is a facet of publishing as well. Bad books do well, good books fail, writers go unnoticed for years and then suddenly become stratospheric. Suzanne Collins' book, The Hunger Games, was her 7th novel. She used to write for Clarissa Explains It All. I would watch that crossover. I went to a talk with Brendan Barrington at Penguin Ireland, and somebody asked, because somebody always asks, what's the next big trend? What's the next big thing? And Brendan gave the weariest sigh I've ever heard from a human mouth and went, if you'd have told me 2 years ago that the best-selling book in the world would be BDSM erotica, I'd have laughed in your face. There's no blueprint. And this does sound daunting and terrible and all up to kind of the whims of the gods, but that's no help to anybody. And I really believe that if you chart careers across the board and go on safari into writing groups, and if you read between the lines in every listicle, side note, I hate the word listicle. There's a word for lists of things. It's list. But you begin to realize that maybe it's not answers that provide a blueprint, but questions. Questions of process, of editing, of submitting, of motivation, of inspiration. How many of you, at any point in your life, on a long car journey, or maybe like walking home from the shop or whatever, played a movie in your head? Like, just imagine something happening. Okay? Yeah? A few of you? Hands up who would like action figures or dolls or both. And when you played with them, were there plot lines? Like sagas of war and betrayal and heartbreak with like a rotating cast of whatever it was you got for your last birthday? The kind of like cinematic crossover that Marvel could like only dream of? Yeah, that was my childhood as well. There was a tree in the field behind my house that had a really good fork about like 8 feet up, and it had these red berries that were like the perfect size for my T-Rex to use as grenades. My T-Rex was a grenadier. And my dad, this is a picture of my dad. He looks like a garden gnome. Or Captain Birdseye. But he would look around and he'd ask, where's David? Oh, is he up in the tree again? It's like, yes, forever. I come from a tiny village in Cavan. Like, there are more people in this room than there are in the village where I'm from. And the only way to stave off the boredom was to play movies in my head. Now, they weren't terribly complicated. Hero saves the world, gets the girl, happens to be ginger. But I never associate... Sorry, can you all hear me at the back? I'm just curious, because I keep like moving back from the thing. Yeah, we're good? Cool. I never associated this with writing, because writing is a mystical art only a few people can do, right? Like, to be a writer, you obviously have to be either English or dead, right? No. Posh people become writers. Geniuses become writers. People from Cavan who look like sunburned broccoli do not become writers. I think I'm about to drop a rap album. There's a terrible standardization that happens, I think, around secondary school. I've done 210 school events in the last year. And the one thing I've noticed is if you tell a 13-year-old they can be a writer, they drop their head and they sort of warble at you, because at some point they've been told that being up a tree is a weird place to be. If you tell a 10-year-old they can be a writer, they're like, yeah, I know, I'm writing a book. We lose this, or it's taken from us, and it takes a lot of work to get it back. Kids are fierce, relentless sponges of information because they lack experience of the world. They're not used to stuff. Adults are used to stuff and beaten down occasionally by stuff, and they don't realize that ideas are constantly sleeting by them or sleeting from them. What exactly makes a writer is kind of difficult to quantify, because writing in itself is quite contradictory. On one side, you need the fierce self-confidence that you have a story that needs to be told. On the other side, you need to think your story is terrible and that you need to improve it. On one side, you need to understand that, like, every single person in this room is an intricate machine full of a billion moving parts that has a slightly different perspective on the world than the person beside them. But you also need to understand that everybody is pretty much the same. Unique commonalities. Let me show you what I mean. I'm not just a bedraggled man who wandered in off the street. Well, I am, but I also wrote a book. So if you've got the book in front of you, which you all do, which is amazing and hilarious, it is page 73. The woman in white was eating light bulbs. Simon couldn't take his eyes off her. It was horrible. She'd found a cupboard on the third-floor corridor about 6 meters from the closet in which Simon was hiding, and had begun rifling through its contents. Linens were experimentally sniffed and then idly tossed aside, forming lonely snowdrifts on the floor. A first aid kit had been emptied out as well, its contents separated with a toe and then methodically stamped apart. Now she was opening boxes of light bulbs, shaking their contents out into her palm and holding them up to her face before closing her teeth around their fragile domes. Crunch. It had taken Simon a moment to realize she wasn't looking for anything in the cupboard. She was just destroying whatever was in there. Why? He didn't know. There was no urgency to her movements, and a strange look of amusement creased her skin. Unfortunately, that meant there was no indication of how long she was going to stay there, blocking the corridor and Simon's only means of escape. It was pure luck she hadn't caught him. A sudden, unexplainable feeling of dread had made him seek refuge in the broom closet, cracking the door open a hair just in time to see her appear at the top of the stairs. Maybe he had heard her without even realizing it. Maybe he'd felt her presence or the air her movements displaced. Maybe the animal part of his brain was taking over, all of that prehistoric instinct and awareness you just didn't use in the modern world. Simon didn't know or care. All that mattered was that he hadn't been caught. Suddenly, the woman's head jerked to one side as if she smelled his relief. She spat a dry clot of glass out onto the floor and closed the cupboard door slowly, listening hard for something. Simon froze, taking his hand off the door so it settled back against the frame, hiding her from view. His heart pounded louder and louder. Stop, stop, she'll hear it, she'll hear it. And the floor creaked as she took a step towards him. Don't panic, don't panic. With the door closed, The woman in white was more of a collection of sounds than a physical presence. Sounds that Simon had to assemble in his head to figure out where she was, a process that was doing nothing for his heart rate. Periodic creaks, her steps. She doesn't care about being quiet, why would she? Followed by a drawling, rasping hiss, her breathing roughened by glass. And then a cascade of stiff, mechanical pops that Simon realised in horror were her fingers, clenching and unclenching. Had he not seen her with his own 2 eyes, he wouldn't have believed there was a person out there at all. Just a machine, gaunt and terrible, bearing down upon him. But more terrifying than that, though, was the silence. Silence meant he had no idea where the woman was. Can you all close your eyes for a second? Humour me. Creak. Silence. Creak. Silence. Simon closed his eyes, then opened them and cursed the sound of both. Everything had become magnified. His heartbeat was thunder, his breathing a storm. The moment stretched maddening, and Simon became convinced he could hear the zzzt of his nervous system, the shh of his sweating skin, and finally, beneath it all, the tick of the future becoming the present 1 second at a time. Silence. The door handle began to turn. Simon felt his stomach go concave at the thought of being that close to the woman's hand. Somehow, magically, he didn't scream. Most children would have screamed by now. He was sure of it. Creak. Maybe just a little scream. It couldn't hurt. Thank you. Who here is afraid of spiders? Hands up. Yep. Makes total sense. Why do you need that many legs? They're up to something. Who here is afraid of heights? Yep. Makes total sense. Nobody likes falling off stuff. What about snakes? Really? But they're so cute. Look at them there. They're lovely. I don't mind snakes that much. I was at a party once with a snake handler, which probably tells you more than you need to know about the kind of parties I go to. And there was a woman walking around with a snake on her shoulders, and she was letting people put it on their shoulders. And me, being an idiot, was like, yeah, go on, give us a go with the snake. So it's on my shoulders, and it's really big and really heavy and feels a bit like an alive handbag. And its head is sort of moving around like this. And I turn to the snake handler and I say, out of curiosity, has this ever gone horribly wrong? And the snake handler went, yeah. And I was like, take it back. When I was a kid, I got glass in my hand. Has anyone here ever got glass in their hand before? Yeah, for those of you who haven't, it's an unpleasant experience. I don't recommend it. And my sister, who's a couple of years older than me, was like, oh, you know, if you get glass in your hand, it works its way into your bloodstream and it cuts you open from the inside out and then you die. I was 3. And it left a mark. So ever since then, I've had a morbid fear of ever getting glass in my hand, which is why when I wanted to create a really awful villain, I could think of nothing worse than someone casually biting into a light bulb. Unique commonalities, things that mean so much to you, you kind of think they might mean something to somebody else. If you visit downtown Minneapolis, right beside Skull Liquor and a bowling alley called Memory Lanes, I love that, there's a place called Orfield Laboratories and the quietest room on earth. In this fiberglass swaddled chamber, you can hear your bones slipping off each other when they move. And Simon, in that scene, is trying to be so quiet, he can literally hear his nervous system. The thing about her knuckles popping mechanically comes from my friend Michelle, who's a primary school teacher. And like all primary school teachers, she's super sweet, and she's super lovely, and she's a black belt in Kenpo. Like all teachers. And because Michelle has spent so much of her life punching stuff, she can now pop each one of her knuckles without touching them. It is exactly halfway between disgusting and awesome. And on her first day of teaching, the kids were being a little bit loud, a little bit rowdy, so Michelle just walked out in front of them and popped each knuckle without breaking eye contact. It sounded like someone racking a shotgun, and all the kids went, ooh. Like, ideas Ideas come from everywhere. I am, as you might be able to tell, quite an easily delighted person. I'm fascinated by people's lives and their careers and everything they get to do that I won't get to do because I'm not that person. I think adults take too much for granted. They get used to not asking questions. They get used to thinking life is just life. I meet a lot of people who think they're too boring to write books, and nobody is too boring to write a book. I'll give you an example. I have a friend called Cormac, and Cormac is very tall, and he's very shy, and he does not know I tell people this story, so you're not allowed to tell him. Although he might after this. And I've been trying to get Cormac to write a book for years, because I think he's a singular person. He thinks he's just Cormac, because he's been Cormac a very long time. But I'll give you an example. You guys can be the judge. When Cormac was 4, he went to Disneyland with his parents, and he went on the Star Wars ride. Any Star Wars fans here? Me. At the end of the Star Wars ride, you're greeted by Darth Vader and 2 stormtroopers. Now, even if you're not a Star Wars fan, you're obviously familiar with Darth Vader. Black cloak, black helmet. Bad guy. Or has really bad asthma, one or the other. I have really bad asthma, so I'm allowed to make that joke. Very important fact about Darth Vader, not a real person. Fictional character. Cormac is 4. So when he sees the Dark Lord of the Sith and Supreme Commander of all Imperial armies come towards his family, story's completely true, he turns to his parents and goes, "Run! Save yourselves!" And he charges Darth Vader. It's completely true. Now, Cormac is quite a tall child, so when he headbutts Darth Vader in the crotch, Darth Vader goes down. And Cormac, not a man to leave a job unfinished, just starts stamping on his neck, screaming at his parents, "Why aren't you running?" Should Cormac write a book? Everybody should write a book. You don't even need to be the only 4-year-old with a lifetime ban from Disney World. That's why Darth Vader has neck armor. It's because of Cormac. How can you not be delighted by something like that, by being that guy? And I know that there's this mystical image of writers being these people waiting for inspiration like kids with their tongues out under a tap, but that's not how it is. Creativity is just questioning everything around you, asking why or why not, asking what if. You can wait for an idea to come to you, or you can start charting the space where it should be, like an astronomer charting where a black hole is by looking at the space between stars. This is why reading is so important. It shows you what's already out there and what needs to be out there still. Knights of the Borrowed Dark is about an orphan who discovers magic. That idea has been done. What? But this is the story that I wanted to tell, because those are the kind of books that I love. So I had to ask myself questions. If I tell you my book is about an orphan who discovers magic, what's the next thing you want to know? Hands up. Why is the kid an orphan? What happened to his parents? Okay, that's very important. Generally, this is terrible. Generally, writers make their kids orphans because if they had parents, the parents would stop them going places. So it's just kind of get out of the way. So yeah, why is this kid an orphan? Why is that important? What else? Does everyone know about magic, or is it a secret thing that's hidden? Okay, very good. These things are very, very different. What else?
What kind of magic?
What kind of magic? Is it the ability to shrink, to throw fire, to make kittens vomit? I don't know. What else?
How common is magic in that world?
How common is magic? Who has it and who doesn't? Haves and have-nots. Very important for conflict. I had to ask myself all of these questions. Knights of the Borrowed Dark comes from... I watch a lot of horror films. And if you've seen any horror films at all, you know there's that scene where the main character is being chased by the zombie or the demon or the stalker or whatever, and they run upstairs. And you're like, why did you run upstairs? Have you never seen a horror film? And the exact same thing happens in books about kids who discover magic. Someone shows up to a kid on their birthday and says, "Hey, would you like to join our secret crusade? It's super dangerous, there's loads of monsters, you'll probably die." And the kid just goes, "Yeah, sounds good." And you're like, that's not realistic. These kids were automatically brave. That's what bothered me. Who here is a brave person? Yeah. There's like one person will put up their hand, everyone else goes, yep, me too. It's so funny doing that in boys' schools and girls' schools. Because boys' schools will go, I am. And I go, are you sure? And they're like, oh, there's a follow-up question. I don't know if I'm a brave person. I'd like to think I am. I'd like to think if I had to stand up for my friends or my family or do the right thing, I would. But I don't think you can know until it's tested. I have a cousin who's a firefighter in New York, and he's been in so many fires that his arms look like melted candle wax. And I was like, how do you keep doing it? Like the first time, fair enough, maybe you didn't know, but how do you keep going in there? And he says, it's a choice. I make it in the morning and then I go to work. The day I can't make that choice, I stop. And that to me is so much more authentic than someone who's just brave. But the thing is, that's not a book. That's barely a sentence. So I had to like ask it questions. Who is this kid? You know, who are their friends? Where does the magic come from? And in doing so, that showed me the blueprint for my story. Like the way you study in college and you realize that like studying just shows you what you don't already know. I should have turned the page while I was talking. I think I did this for a living. And there's with writing, there's always a sort of a duality. There's always sort of two things. So like on one side, you go outwards. You look at what's being done and you try and do something. You try and go further than anyone else has gone before. But on the other side, you go inwards because the one story people can't tell is yours. Sometimes you end up in situations so ridiculous, you know they should go into a book. The following story is completely true. I was walking to the shop late one night because I really wanted crisps. I don't think that's weird. Crisps are important. And on the way to the shop, I had to go through a park. Now, when I got into the park, I stopped because on the far side of the park, there was a guy. And the guy was standing there like this. I was like, I've seen this film. I know how this goes. And my worry was made a lot worse because as soon as the guy saw me, he went, you, come here. You look like a smart person. Which, when you think about it, is exactly the kind of thing a zombie would say. I'm not going to lie, I was torn. Because on one side, I really wanted crisps. But on the other, I didn't want to die. But crisps won out, as they so often do. And I began to walk towards him. Now, the closer I got to him, the more I realized that everything possible that could happen to a man's face had happened to this man's face. He was a rough gentleman. He was like, walking like a velociraptor, apparently. I've got something I want to run by you, because you look like a smart person. Okay. You know the way the world's a dangerous place? I'm beginning to. Well, what if me and a bunch of lads were to just go around keeping people safe on the quiet like? Now, we wouldn't ask a soft lad like you to do it. And I was like, all right, fair enough. And there's a word for it. There's a word for it. I know, there's a word for it. And I was like, vigilante? And he went, I knew you were a smart person. And I couldn't help myself. I went, like Batman. Wrong answer. He leaned in so close I could see each individual scar, and finally he whispered, I would be like Batman. Then he gave me a hug. So once I survived that, I knew it had to go into a story somewhere. And I'm not talking about just writing out bits of your own life, but people do that, and you can analyze a moment. Ask yourself why it stuck with you. And even if all you take from it is a grin or a whisper or an eyelash, that is fuel for a story. I'm going to do another scene from Nights of the Bar of Dark now, page 154, which was sort of inspired by my encounter with the crisp gentleman. And in this scene, my protagonist, Denizen Hardwick, has been asked to join the Knights of the Bar of Dark, this secret organization of men and women who keep us safe from extra-dimensional predators called Tenebris. Now, the more the knights use their magic, the more it slowly turns them to iron. Because bravery is a choice, bravery carries a cost. So obviously, they're not going to force Denizen to join. But they say, look, we have to go face a breach, we have to go face a Tenebris in this little small Irish town in the middle of the night. Come with us, see if you can handle this job. work experience. Now, the fight does not go well, and they tell Denizen to run for his life. So when this scene opens, Denizen is running down this dark country road, and part of him is feeling really, really bad for leaving his friends behind, but the other part of him is really relieved, because in the battle, he was crap. And that's when he runs into a character that you guys met earlier. Oh no. They'll be all right. They're warriors. Sorry, do you know, maybe is it a bad idea if I keep moving back and forth? Does that make things... No, it's fine. Cool. They'll be all right. They're warriors. This is what they do. It didn't sound very convincing, even in the privacy of his own head. I just be in the way. The lights of the village appeared ahead, a false dawn beckoning hope. Now they don't have to worry about me. There was a woman standing in the middle of the street. The breach still infected the streetlights, curbing their luminescence to firefly glimmers trapped in glass. Her shadow arched across the road, huge and gaunt and close enough to touch. Hello, Denizen said awkwardly. It was all he could think of to say. White lips curved in a smile. Hello, Denizen repeated, feeling a little silly. Are you okay? He trailed off as he took in the woman's blank smile, the way she stood with one shoulder higher than the other, body stooped as if held beneath the pinch of a thumb and forefinger. She didn't seem to understand what he had just said. Miss? The woman didn't respond, hands digging in the pockets of her white overcoat. Eventually, she pulled out a loose cigarette and jammed it in the fold of her smirk. It hung there, unlit. Horror began to curl its way through Denizen's stomach. The woman looked like she wasn't quite there, as if something essential had been taken from her. Her hair was a ragged white cascade framing thin cheekbones and colourless lips. She took a staggering step forward, her cigarette bobbing in the air. He couldn't just leave her. She was the first person that he'd seen. He should help her, get her somewhere safe. It wasn't exactly fighting a Tenebris, but it was the right thing to do. Miss, miss, why don't you come with me? I know some people who might be able to help you. Miss? The woman raised her head in a series of slow jerks, and Denizen suddenly realized he'd made a huge mistake. It was her eyes. They were bright and pale and normal, or at least a fiend's guess of what normal should be. Gray's words from the park suddenly came back to him. They look wrong. Even the really old Tenebris that try to look human. It's the little things, the face, the eyes. She hadn't done a terrible job, at least as far as Denizen could see. All the bits were there, irises, eyelids, whites. Any doll maker would be proud. It's not like there was a way to fake the things that actually made an eye human, like love, or pity, or hope. The cigarette fell away as the woman's jaw clacked open, bearing a throat filled with a mass of delicate clockwork, a tunnel of cogs and gears and spindle wheels, all wet and shining oily black. Her howl made the ground vibrate and far-off windows shatter. Ah! The echoes took a very long time to die away. Oh, said Denizen in a small voice. Right. Thank you. So there's one issue with the questioning philosophy, because asking questions is wonderful, but once you do it, it's sort of hard to stop. Certain questions start, after a while, asking themselves. Questions like, what if this isn't any good? What if I'm wasting my time? Why am I doing this to myself? I started sending Knights of the Borrowed Dark out to agents on November the 1st, 2013, and I started getting answers. No was the answer that I got constantly. And in the meantime, I began to question the work. I began to question myself. But the one thing that I had learned from writing the book and from interrogating each idea is that some answers give you options and some answers are dead ends. Taking no for an answer means no is the answer. If I wanted to change the answer I was getting from agents, I had to look at what I was doing wrong. I went through every single line in the book, asking myself, is this line the right one? Is this plot point the right one? Why am I saying vicious? Do I actually mean cruel? Why am I saying cerulean when I really mean cerise? Mark Twain says that the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. And every word does make a difference because on average, like my agent would get 300 submissions a week. She reads the first line. If it's good, she reads the second line. If she doesn't, she stops. Who here has heard the word grand before? Yeah, really, really common Irish phrase. I wanted to set the book in Ireland because everything is set in London because London's really cool. But each word makes a difference. So I used to live in Egypt, as you can tell by my amazing tan, running from shadow to shadow like the vampire of Cairo. There's such a thing as factor 80. Like, that would stop a bullet. Anyway, but when I was over there, the local librarian, Mr. Gamil, was like, I was teaching there. He's like, Mr. David, I have a question. Every day you come in and I ask you how you are, and you say, I'm grand. Yeah. But I looked up the word grand, and it means large and majestic. And I was like, well, yeah, body positivity. Also, we say right over here when we mean okay. Right, I'm going down the shop. Right, I'm going to do my homework. They don't say that in Egypt, so I used to go into school and go, right, kids, and they'd all go. It's like, no. Every single word makes a difference. There's a line in the first chapter where one of my villains, the man in the waistcoat, is speaking. And the man in the waistcoat is gross. Everything about him is gross. Even his voice is gross. The words roll off his tongue like cockroaches. I was really proud of that line. Until my friend Graham pointed out that cockroaches don't roll. So it's like the word skittered from his tongue like a cockroach. Better. This is what you have to do. When it came to writing other genders and ethnicities, I gave my book to people of those genders and ethnicities and was like, tear this book apart. Make sure what I'm writing is authentic. These are experiences I haven't lived. Tell me what I'm doing wrong. I edited, I interrogated, I sent it out again. 25 agents, 25 no's. And finally, Claire Wallace at Darley Anderson took me on. We worked on one more draft together, and then she asked me, do you want to know who I'm sending it to? I was like, no, I'll freak out. And she's like, okay, now this process could take weeks. Okay. It could take months. Okay. It might never, okay, Claire, I get it, thank you. So 13 days later, on my birthday, fun fact about me, I was born the day before Valentine's Day. Had I been born 6 hours later, my mother swears she would have called me Valentine. I couldn't pull that off now. I definitely couldn't pull it off as a 15-year-old in West Cavan. But I was in a €2 shop on George's Street, to give you an idea of where I was financially, with my girlfriend at the time, and we were trying to decide between the fancy €1 soup and the normal dust-flavoured 50-cent soup and a baguette. And she was like, Puffin want the book. And is like, right, what do you think we should do? And she was like, I think we should say yes. And I was like, okay, get the €1 soup. And I really thought my job was done at that point. I thought you plateau out, the book comes out great. And the first thing my editor said to me was, so we have some questions? And I was like, I'm so sick of this book. Ben is lovely. When he says he has questions, what he means is we have comments. Thousands upon thousands of comments. So we've got too many mentions of the sound the car makes. Okay. Repetition, avoid, repetition, avoid, repetition, avoid. This one is particularly embarrassing. It's October. It was November in the previous scene. I've accidentally written a book about time travel. And the thing is, we went through 6 drafts with the book. And the thing is, that's fine. Like every event I've done, every edit, every argued over comma, all of the rejections and the effort and all of the questions, all of the self-doubt really come down to one question. Are you going to be a writer? If your answer is yes, it simplifies things. And I'm not being reductive. Just because a question is small doesn't mean it's not complicated, but it is a guiding principle. Neil Gaiman talks about the mountain, a list of things he wants to achieve in his career. Anything that brings you closer to the mountain is good. Anything that takes you away from the mountain is bad. So interrogate that idea, finish that chapter, apply to that agent, re-edit your chapter, reapply to the agents, do whatever it takes to get there because you've decided you're going to get there. That's the blueprint. That's your answer. Thank you. So, if you have any questions about writing or beards or crisps, the only 3 things I know anything about. Should we? Oh yeah, cool.
So much for being such an emotional
Thank you.
and telling us in detail like how not only the writing process but like how it goes overall. And I'm especially wondering if you ever tried like non-fiction novels, if you ever experimented, and do you ever use non-fiction insights in building your fiction, and how could you finalize on settling down on your own voice?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. So in terms of working in nonfiction, I'm a little bit terrified by nonfiction because you're really putting yourself on display. I like hiding behind monsters and things like that. But your work, people say, you know, where do you get your ideas for your work? And it all just comes from yourself. So I wrote Knights of the Borrowed Dark at a time when all of the villains that I saw in media were really cool and kind of sexy. Tom Hiddleston, basically. All the villains were Tom Hiddleston. And they all had like cool plans and you could almost sort of like identify with them. And I wanted to do something different. Now, I was bullied really badly when I was in school. This is the product of years of theatre, not my upbringing. And I was like, in order to make it authentic, in order to share something that in order to make something authentic, I was like, what scares me? And what scares me are bullies, still. Like the idea that you can, like we all have that dream that like someone will say something horrible to you in school and you'll turn and go, yeah, well, cool line. Knowing that even if you did do that, the bully would just go, shut up. And you'd be like, oh, okay, you win. So my 3 villains are called the Clockwork Three. There's the man in the waistcoat who is every single cruel comment, like every single person shouting at you from a bus stop. There's the woman in white who you met, who is like brute force. And then there's the opening boy, who's a hurt child, because that's what bullies are. And the sheer meanness and pettiness of them comes from my own kind of experience. The cost as well, like I would have went through very bad depression in my first and second year of college, basically, once I got away from home, but things still kind of followed me. And I had an awful problem with kind of self-harm, which I'm through now, and writing sort of replaced that. And like the great thing about writing is you can pour all your angst out, and at the end of it, you have art or possibly a job. But that's sort of reflected in the cost, where I'm not ashamed of the fact that my arms look like barcodes, but it's a thing that happened to me, and it's like, it's part of who you are. So the knights, you can tell a career knight because they've got iron blooming across their face. They wear their experiences on their skin. So yeah, like it all sort of comes from, like, I say I don't write non-fiction, but like there's lots of it kind of there. I'm sort of getting into it now. I have to talk about Terry Pratchett later, which is the scariest thing in the world because I love him, and I hope I don't get it wrong. But yes, yeah, cool. With regards finding your voice, I was a Neil Gaiman cover band for years. I wrote in other people's voices because I didn't have any of my own, and that took years. Like I started writing when I was 20, and I think I attempted the novel when I was 25, and it was the first thing I'd ever written in my voice. So like if you read the book, it just sounds like I'm talking to you, for better or worse. And it took me a long time of practice before I got the basics of writing down, before I stopped worrying about trying to sound like a writer, and was like, maybe if I tend to make people laugh when I talk to them, maybe I should just talk like that. So like, it's sort of trial and error and writing around your voice until eventually you just start writing your voice, basically. Cool, good question though.
I'll go to another question. I just have a question for you, Dave. You talked to me about world building before, and I think that's a fascinating part of what you do. And even you just briefly said there, the world that you've created here for this series might live on in another book somewhere. Maybe just tell us a little bit about the art of world building. I think you talked a bit about asking questions, but just how does that work for you as a writer in terms of building worlds?
Cool. So every line or every word you put down is an opportunity to get something across to the reader, but you don't have that much time, basically. Like, as I said, my agent gets 300 submissions a week. You need to hook people from the very first line. So I could give people an encyclopedic background to the knights and their history through Europe, but that's not what my audience want to read. So in my first draft of the book, I write long. I pack in every detail, every cool thing I've thought of. I really interrogate my concept. So the idea of the knights turning to iron. I go, okay, what is every single possible permutation or cool thematic thing from that? I mightn't use all of them, but I need to know them. So I write the first draft long, I throw in everything that I can think of, and then when I go to the second draft, I start paring it back and going, what is actually needed to be known in this scene? Is this something I can wait till like chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 10? So like you're drip feeding your reader because you want them to constantly turn the page. In terms of world building, I like magic that makes sense. I know that's a ridiculous thing to say, but I think magic is this great, cool, thematic thing. Like with science fiction, I love science fiction, but science fiction sort of has to make a sort of scientific sense. Magic can make narrative sense, and I love concepts that you get lots of kind of legs out of, basically. Has anyone read the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher? They're a book about a private eye in Chicago who's also a wizard, and they're great. And in the first book, the way it's explained why no one knows about magic is because magic and technology don't work. Like if you try and film magic, your computer or your camera fritzes out or whatever. And that could just be there. I mean, that's in Harry Potter, like that's a common thing. But he analyzes and interrogates that one concept and gets so much sort of emotional depth out of it. So Harry Dresden is your sort of typical gumshoe, like he's very like, all he has is his word, is his balls, and he don't like break them for anybody kind of thing. So the fact that he can only use stuff from like the 1930s because it's like not technologically complicated enough, and the fact he can only he eats basically the same thing every day, kind of feeds into his character. And then later on, he can't go visit his friend in the hospital because all the life support machines will die. And it's like, you really just, like a good concept just has legs basically, and you get like plot out of it. And then also it helps you figure out plot holes. Like I had a kid ask me once, the cost, the turning to iron, is it like scar tissue? And I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, well, if you get scar tissue at a joint, you have to work out, otherwise it'll seize up. And I was like, that is the best thing I've ever heard. So now all the knights like pop their knuckles and things like that, just like keep themselves limber. So like your world building is a chance to get across theme and character to your reader. It all has to be connected. Like Denizen is an incredibly repressed, neurotic, anxious person. And his magic is this wellspring of fire that's constantly seeking to get out, but the more it gets out, the more it shuts you off from the world. So like, yeah, it's a thing, basically.
There's a question over here.
I was wondering how you were coping with, or rather not now that you are officially a writer, but before you were a writer, how you were coping with the sort of discipline of writing and fitting it in. And was that an easy thing for you because you said it sort of replaced depression issues, or was it a struggle to get sort of the routine going and get the actual work done?
It is a constant struggle. The only reason I sound in any way competent is because I planned out what I was going to say beforehand. Like, you talk about like, oh, it was this lovely path and you got there and rejected, but like, no, it is a constant battle. And like, I really, there's a writer called Oisin McGann who's been around for 10 years and his wife is a librarian, and she was driving me to a gig and I was like, yeah, I really feel now that I've got book one out of the way, I can really start finding a routine. And she's like, yeah, Oisin's been saying that for a decade, Dave. Good luck. It's really, really tough. Like you have to write around your job because people need to live, people need to pay bills. With the benefit of hindsight, what I do is set yourself surmountable goals. You are not going to sit down and write a novel in one day if you haven't written much before. Set yourself writing 200 words 3 times a week. Once you find that really easy, move yourself up to 300 per session. Like, treat it like Couch to 5K, which I will finish someday. Like, you train yourself. Like, now, if I'm writing a first draft, I sit down and I do 1,000 words 4 times a week. Because 1,000 words is a scene. It feels like it's a half a chapter if you're writing children's fiction. And I don't try and go beyond that, because if I tried to sit down and write 5,000 words in a day, I would fail, and then I would have failure hanging over me, and I would feel bad the next day. Like, I generally stop myself just as I'm getting really, really excited, because it means I hit the next day like a ton of bricks. It's weird, the games you have to play with yourself when you want to be a writer. Like, you have to sort of not be too hard on yourself, but also be super hard on yourself, because if you don't write your book, no one's going to write it. Like, now I have to write my books, because otherwise Puffin will break my legs. I made that joke on Tubridy, and I got a phone call from them being like, Dave, can you not make jokes about us breaking your legs? And I was like, or you'll what? But now I have deadlines, and now I have people I will let down, so it makes it sort of easier and more pressure. Whereas when you write your first book, no one's going to be hanging over you, so you need to be tough on yourself. Whether that means like reaching out to a community and finding writing groups, or even having just one or two friends who are going to like be like, write that book. Like you just need to get it done. I will say as well though, you don't have to get it right on the first try. It's more important to get a book finished than it is for that book to be perfect on the first draft. Like I meet a lot of people who've written really good first chapters and never written chapter 2 because they're obsessed with making it perfect, whereas chapter 35 is going to change your first chapter. So it's better to get it down so you can see what's good and what needs to be changed. So write the thing, basically. It's super basic advice, but yeah, get it done.
Is there any more questions? We have one over there. Oh, we have a microphone.
Hi.
Hi.
When you get edit after edit from book doctors and editors and publishing houses, at what point do you say, no, this isn't an error, this is my style, I'm going to keep this one? Is it important to resist, or do you take all the feedback?
Generally with, like I'm quite lucky, and generally if you're a professional editor, you're good at what you do. So like Ben, every edit, his favorite phrase is, let's discuss. Where basically he'll say, I don't quite get what you're saying, why don't you try and explain it? And I might have a perfectly good reason for that being there. And he goes, well, I didn't get it from the text. Because when you're writing your book, you have it all in the back of your head. You know how everything works. Whereas the reader is only picking up what you've put down on the page. So 99% of the time, they've been right. Like when I handed in book 1, there was a chapter in it, and which is probably one of the best chapters I've ever written. And Ben, the first time I met him, he was like, well, look, your book isn't out for 2 years, so we don't have to talk about the changes I want to make. And I was like, what kind of changes do you want to make? And he's like, we don't need to talk about this now. And I was like, yeah, what changes do you want to make? And he was like, well, I think the main character reads as a 13-year-old, not a 15-year-old, because there's no love interest, there's no even kind of hint of that. And I was like, yeah, actually, that does make sense. And he's like, oh, and I think this character should come in a bit earlier. And I was like, yeah, okay, that's quite good. And he's like, oh, and I think you should cut that chapter. And I swear to God, the temperature of the room dropped 30 degrees. And I was like, you want me to what? And he was like, it doesn't fit the book. Like, it's a great 1,700 words, but it's, what he said was, like, straight to my heart, it's an Empire Strikes Back moment in what should be A New Hope. And I was like, that's a good way of describing it. But I was raging at him for like, and like my agent was like, we don't need to talk about this now. We can like, actually we can have a bit of a chat about agents later. They're really good as go-betweens and having the awkward conversations you don't want to. But normally they're right. But generally what they'll say is, they don't tell you how to fix it. They tell you, you're not getting this across to the reader, find a solution. And often the solution you find will obviously make the book better and be even more elegant. Like, they're just signposting things that you haven't thought of because your book is your baby and you think it's fantastic. So like, there's only a few things I've ever fought them on. Like, when it comes to word choice, like there's a line in book 1 where it's like, his eyes narrowed like an uncle disappointed. And they were like, you mean like a disappointed uncle? And I was like, no, I specifically mean like an uncle disappointed. And they were like, okay. We had a moment when the American edit came out where the main character drinks a lot of tea, obviously, because he's from Mayo, and the American editor was like, hey, we think it might be more age appropriate if you have him drinking cocoa. And I was like, this is Ireland. We drink tea in Ireland. We give tea to babies in Ireland. Cocoa's for people with notions. And they backed off. And normally they will back off if you can make your case strong enough to keep it, they'll go, okay, like you know what you're talking about. But generally it's that horrible thing where they say, what about this? And you're like, oh yeah, okay, cool. I did fight them on book 2 because the main character has he gets 2 knives in book 2 because he's useless with one, so he may as well double up. Dual wield. And he's got them in sheaths underneath his armpits. And he's really proud because he manages to, will you hold this for a second?
Yes, of course.
He manages to draw them both without hand-capitating himself. Thank you. I was delighted with that word. And my editor was like, hand-capitate isn't a word, Dave. And I was like, but look at it though, it's so beautiful. She was like, even if it was a word, it would be dehanditate, because cap means head. And I was like, please just give me this one thing. And she's like, fine. So I got my hancapitate. It is always a conversation. They will never force you, basically. So you just talk it out. It's very situational. You just talk it out with them and see. So so far, it's been fine, basically.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one last question, and then we're out of time, I'm afraid. So, right here.
I'm happy to stick around for like a couple of minutes afterwards if people want to ask questions like one-on-one.
Thanks, Dave.
Hi. So I always love to read the first line of a book that introduces a writer, and you say Dave Rudden enjoys Cat's adventure and being cruel to fictional children. How does, as a children's fiction writer, it work to be cruel to fictional children? Has it ever gotten you into any trouble? Like in a modern age where you have helicopter parents or social justice warriors, did it ever get you into any kind of like, no, that guy?
Kids love that. That's the one thing that kids come to me is like, you always say it's like being cruel to fictional children. It's like, yeah, like I like books with like angst and danger and where people are on the absolute edge of their nerves the whole time. My bio and even the first line of the book, which is looking back, it had been a mistake to fill the orphanage with books, was sort of my mission statement because I knew that my agent or the 26 people who could be my agent would look at the first line first, and I was like, this is who I am as a person. I want to write a book that's kind of mean to kids because kids love that. Like if you come turn around to a 12-year-old, which is who the book is for, and you're like, how's it go? Look at you there. They're like, I'm 12. Which if you walk in and go, what's wrong with you? Why are you so small? They love it. They think it's great, and like. There is a lot of precedent. Like Lemony Snicket was super successful. Like every big word I know from Lemony Snicket, like plateau or marmalade. And like, I wanted a book that sort of pushed the envelope. It's the first time I kind of written for kids, and I was like, an editor will pull me back. There's no swearing in the book. Swearing is a thing you can't do in kids' books. Violence, you can get away with. Like romances, that stuff is kind of fine. Swearing is pretty much a no. So there were a couple of lines I had to take out of the book because they just wouldn't work without it in them. I went in going, I want to write a book that's like dark and weird and upsetting, and if kids have a problem with it or want to talk about the themes, I will talk about the themes. Same with parents. I've done parent-teacher meetings. I can be like, what was the problem your kid had with the book? It's generally a problem the parents have with the book, and it's like, well, this is why I did it, and hope I'm charming enough that they go, oh, okay. No, my books are mean to kids. That's pretty much that's my mission statement.
Well, listen, I think we're out of time. Dave, I should point out that the second book, The Forever Court, is out next Friday.
It's on sale from the 31st of March, and we're doing a launch in Eason's at 6 o'clock, on Eason's on O'Connell Street at 6 o'clock, and it's been launched by Owen Colfer. Be still my fanboy heart. And you should come along. There will be Prosecco and sweets. So
definitely come along. Listen, huge round of applause. Thanks to Dave.
Thank you. Cheers.